It's really amazing, when you stumble across these little historical tidbits that just catch you completely off guard. Like,
Yeah.
did you know that back in the 1920s, there was this small sawmill town in Arkansas, of all places, that had an X-ray machine? And get this, it was more advanced than what a lot of bigger cities had at the time. Just imagine that. A small town seemingly in the middle of nowhere, right on the cutting edge of medical technology. It's those kinds of stories that really spark my curiosity, and it's exactly what we're going to be digging into today.
And what makes this even more intriguing is that this one detail, this X-ray machine, actually opens up this whole fascinating story. And it's a story that you, our listener, have brought to us with this awesome collection of sources you've shared. So we're going to take a deep dive into the history of Crossett, Arkansas. And of course, we can't talk about Crossett without talking about the man behind it all, a visionary leader named Cap Gates.
You got it. And we're talking about a treasure trove of information here, folks. Personal accounts of Cap Gates' life, the businesses he built, stories about what daily life was like in those early days of Crossett. We've got excerpts about his efforts to get that X-ray machine we mentioned, stories from Cap Gates' tent city and wilderness lady that give us a glimpse into those early days, the challenges, the community that grew there. And we even have the founding fathers of the Crossett Experimental Forest, which delves into the origins of sustainable forestry practices. So our mission today is to put all these pieces together, like a historical jigsaw puzzle, to understand how this town went from wilderness to a lumber powerhouse and then, surprisingly, became a pioneer in sustainable forestry and community building. It's a story of resilience, innovation, and the impact that one person's vision can have. And speaking of vision, let's start with the man himself, Cap Gates. He was clearly more than just a lumberman, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you look at his background, which is what you've done, our listener, you see these pivotal moments that really shaped him, that shaped his character, and ultimately his vision for Crossett. He was born in Big Rod, Iowa, back in 1866, and early on, his life took a pretty dramatic turn. He had this mining accident in Colorado, left him with sight in only one eye, but, he didn't let that define him. He didn't let that stop him. He took that energy and forged a new path, eventually ending up in Arkansas, right in the heart of the booming lumber industry.
And it seems like that move to Arkansas really ignited something in him. Because when you think about the typical sawmill town of that era, they were often, rough around the edges, temporary. But Gates, he had something different in mind for Crossett. He wasn't just focused on cutting down trees. He wanted to create a refined community, a place where families would want to settle down, where people were treated with respect. And you see this vision reflected in his plans for the Rose Inn.
Exactly right. The Rose Inn, it wasn't just some ordinary hotel. It was a statement, a symbol of his aspirations for Crossett. Think about it. Other lumber settlements, they had pretty basic, often rough lodging. But the Rose Inn, it was designed to be grand, elegant. They had electric lights, can you believe that, in 1912? A fine dining experience. It was meant to be a place where people could do business, come together as a community. And the fact that he named it after his wife, Rose Kennebrew Gates, I think that speaks volumes about how personally invested he was in making this a special place, something for you, our listener, to really consider.
So it became this symbol of his vision, a beacon of sophistication in this undeveloped area. That's why it's almost heartbreaking to learn about the fire that destroyed it just a year after it opened. I mean, for a lot of towns, that kind of setback could have been devastating. But what really stands out is how Gates responded.
It really does. The sources you've provided really emphasize his immediate decision to rebuild. There was no hesitation, no giving up. He understood what the Rose Inn represented, the kind of town he was building. So he had it rebuilt on the same foundation, using the same blueprints. That act of resilience, I think it really highlights his commitment to Crossett's future, a commitment that would shape the town you've researched. It's also interesting to note that the rebuilt Rose Inn, it eventually gained national recognition, even being featured in Ford Times decades later, before it was finally demolished in the mid-70s. The end of an era, but it certainly left its mark on the town's history.
So we see this grand vision, right, embodied by the Rose Inn. But let's step back a bit and look at how Crossett came to be in the first place.
Yeah.
How did this great wilderness, as some called it, become a functioning sawmill town?
Well, that's a story in itself. It shows you how determined Gates was. He originally wanted to set up his sawmill in Hamburg, Arkansas. But the local leaders there, they weren't too keen on the idea. They were worried about all the workers coming in, what that would mean for their town. Understandable, really. But Gates, he didn't give up. He looked south to this largely undeveloped area. He started buying up land, something like 47,000 acres south of Hamburg. Eventually, he amassed nearly 100,000 acres. He saw the potential, all that virgin pine forest.
And there's this great story about how he chose the exact spot for Crossett. It's almost like a scene out of a movie, him and his tired horse. But it was his conversation with Judge Lacella that seems to have been the real turning point.
Yes, you've been reading those sources. So Gates, he's writing with Judge Jim Latella, who was a big help in getting that timberland. They come to this area near Frost Prairie, and Gates, he's probably a bit worn out, frustrated after being rejected by Hamburg. He's like, what's even here? And Lachala, his reply became pretty famous, nothing. And that is the big attraction. I mean, that's perfect, right? It was a blank canvas for Gates, a place where he could build his vision from scratch.
So he found his spot.
Yeah.
But then came the challenge of actually getting a sawmill there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't exactly a walk in the park, was it?
No, not at all. They had to move the first sawmill from Wilmore, a town further north. Can you imagine the logistics of that? 8 horses hauling this massive mill piece by piece over miles of rough terrain. Talk about determination. They got it set up and running, and then things moved incredibly fast. I mean, they were so eager to start production that they were cutting trees even before the mill was completely assembled. They started laying railroad tracks soon after. Essential for moving all that timber, of course.
Wow, that's a real picture of rapid development. And what was life like in those early days, say from 1901 to 1905? What was it like to be part of this brand new community?
Well, the sources you've given us really paint a picture of those early years. You had people like A.C. Moncrief and George Lissor. They were some of the first to arrive, instrumental in getting things going. The population was tiny, maybe 100 people, mostly working in the lumber operation. Housing, well, it was pretty basic. Lots of families were living in tents, hence the nickname Tent Town. But they were focused on building those essential community structures. The first church went up quickly in 1902, partly because of state regulations about how close churches had to be to saloons. You can see Gates' influence there, wanting a more family-oriented town. The Methodist Church was a big part of those early days. People like A.T. Sparks, really active in the community.
And we also see the very beginnings of essential services popping up, right?
Yes, definitely. The first post office was actually in the company store, which just shows you how central the company was to everything in those early days. Frank Cannon, he was the first postmaster, and he also did the bookkeeping for the company. You can see how interconnected everything was. Then, around 1903, the first bank opened right inside the lumber company office. When it comes to actual homes, George Lesser's house is noted as the first major house built in Crossett. And for education, they established a simple one-room schoolhouse. It's amazing to see a town literally being built from the ground up.
And amidst all this building, all this community development, there was still the grueling reality of logging. It must have been incredibly hard work.
Oh, without a doubt. And early logging methods, well, they were pretty basic, often dangerous. One thing that stood out from the sources you've shared is that they used pine knots to fuel the logging engines. That's risky business, often led to fires. Eventually, they switched to coal, much safer, more efficient. But those early days, definitely full of challenges.
So the company store seems to have been absolutely essential to this emerging town. It was much more than just a place to buy things, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. It was the lifeline of Crossett, especially in those early decades. You have to remember how isolated it was. That store, it was the main source, sometimes the only source for everything. Clothes, food, furniture, everything. It was absolutely vital for those early residents.
And the way it operated, it sounds almost like it was built on trust.
It was pretty unique, the credit system they used. Employees could buy what they needed without getting an immediate bill. It was all tracked. And if someone had trouble paying at the end of the year, well, the manager would often just extend more credit. It really speaks to a strong sense of community, of looking after each other.
It wasn't just about buying and selling, though. The company store was also a social hub, right?
Exactly. It was the place where everyone gathered, farmers coming in from the countryside, loggers coming in from the camps, mill workers from town. It had different departments for everything. Groceries, dry goods, hardware, shoes. Hazen Bryant, who moved to Crossett in 1922, he said it was much more than a store. It was the heart of the community. Even during the Depression, the store helped people get through those tough times.
They even had some unusual amenities for a company store, especially one in such a remote area.
Right. They had their own ice house, vital for keeping food fresh before refrigerators. And they even had a bottling plant that made their own soda, Gaiola. They had to adapt. Early on, people would just tie their horses up out back. Then as cars became more common, they'd park out front on what was basically a dirt street.
But it wasn't always just everyday life and community gatherings. There was a pretty dramatic event that happened at the store, wasn't there?
Yeah, there's this account of a shootout that happened at the southeast door of the commissary between two men, Shipley and Vivian. Sadly, it was a fatal incident. But it's interesting because it seems to be one of the few instances of that kind of violence in those early days. Despite being a frontier town, Crossett seems to have been a relatively orderly place.
So from the company store, let's move on to the logging camps. These were basically mobile communities that followed the timber operations, right?
Exactly. As the company expanded, these camps became essential. They provided housing, basic services for the loggers working far out in the forest. A typical camp would have a company store, a YMCA that also served as a place for religious services, a basic school for the kids, and even small railroad repair shops.
And the houses, I understand they were designed specifically for this temporary lifestyle.
That's right. Most were simple, 2 or 3 room structures, built on these large wooden sleepers so they could be loaded onto flat cars and moved along the tram railroad to the next logging site. Pretty clever system. They could move the whole community as the work progressed.
You know, it's interesting. You might think that living in these temporary remote camps would be tough, but some people seem to actually prefer it.
Yeah, it's true. The sources you found suggest that a lot of people liked the quieter, close-knit atmosphere of the camps compared to the towns, and they often had space to keep livestock, chickens, pigs, cows, even gardens. When it was time to move, they'd just load up their houses on flat cars, no big disruption to their lives.
There was one camp, though, the Crossett camp, that seems to have been a bit different, more permanent.
Yes. The Crossett camp, near Shamanihopt Creek, which means Big Creek in the Choctaw language, was the last and most well-known of these camps. At the time, they weren't really expecting the shift to log trucks and power saws that happened later, so they laid out this camp with actual streets. It even had separate sections for white and black residents, reflecting the times, of course. The houses were built on piers, more securely fixed. They even had electric lights and running water. Quite a step up from the earlier camps.
And the commissary of the Crossett camp, it must have been just as important as the main company store in town.
Oh, absolutely. People described it as a marvel. They had everything. Staple foods like bologna, canned goods, lard, flour, sugar, cured hams, even green coffee beans, hardware, some furniture. And they still use that credit system with punch cards, so workers could buy what they needed between paydays.
It wasn't all just work and no play, though. What was the social life like in these camps?
Well, the YMCA was the center of it all. It was a real multi-purpose building, an auditorium, a basketball court, a place for church services. People could go there to read, play checkers or chess, just relax and socialize. They even had movie nights every week, a big event for everyone in the camp.
It's fascinating how these isolated temporary communities develop their own culture, their own values.
It is. The camp boss, he was the main authority figure, and there was a big emphasis on keeping order and a sense of community. People who caused trouble, especially those who drank too much, well, they weren't tolerated. They'd be asked to leave. There might have been some gambling and some, shall we say, homebrewing going on, but it was kept pretty low-key. People wanted a stable and peaceful environment.
And education was clearly important, even in these logging camps.
Absolutely. The school at the Crossett camp was known for being really good, comparable to the schools in Crossett and even Hamburg. They had some great teachers, like Silas D. Snow, who went on to become the president of the University of Central Arkansas, and Miss Gussie Price, who became a respected principal in Crossett. Discipline was strict, kids had to dress neatly, and there were special programs for holidays.
It's important to remember, though, that these camps, like much of the South at the time, were segregated.
That's right. The sources do indicate that there were separate schools and churches for Black residents in the camps, reflecting the realities of the time.
The decline of the logging camps really marked a turning point in the timber industry.
Definitely. As log trucks became more common and efficient, and as contract logging became more widespread, those big, centralized camps just weren't as economical anymore. The Crossett camp, the last of its kind in the area, closed in 1934. There are some great anecdotes from that time, people adjusting to life back in Crossett. Mrs. Gnomes, for instance, she was worried about what she'd do with her cows once they moved. And there's a story about a neighbor's chicken that got loose during the move. It was the end of a way of life. And the stories really capture that mix of sadness and anticipation as these close-knit communities were dispersed.
Amazingly, you can still find traces of those camps today.
That's right. The author of Wilderness Lady talks about visiting the site of the Crossett camp years later, seeing remnants of the houses, the concrete floor of the old wash house, the dynamite house all covered in honeysuckle, even bits and pieces of the old school ground. It's a connection to a fascinating chapter in the town's history.
So, from this era of rapid timber harvesting and the unique world of the logging camps, Crossett underwent a pretty amazing transformation. They moved towards sustainable forestry. But that wasn't always the focus, was it?
Not initially. Like a lot of companies back then, the focus was on cutting as much timber as possible, as quickly as possible. The forest seemed endless. Cap Gates himself even encouraged people to farm the land after the timber was cleared, but the soil wasn't really good for that. But as they saw the timber supply dwindling, they realized something had to change. They started seeking out expert advice.
It seems like a real turning point, a shift towards a more scientific long-term vision.
Definitely. They brought in trained foresters like Albert Wackerman who helped implement new practices, things like leaving certain trees standing to help the forest regenerate naturally. A big shift in thinking from just taking the timber to actually managing the forest as a resource.
And this led to the creation of something truly groundbreaking, didn't it?
It did. In 1934, they established the Crossett Experimental Forest. This was huge, not just for Crossett, but for forestry in general, a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service and the Crossett Lumber Company. Under the leadership of Russell Roy Reynolds, they started doing all this research, developing new techniques for sustainable forestry. They were pioneers in something called sustained yield management, which basically means making sure you don't harvest more timber than the forest can regrow each year. They also had programs like Farm Forestry 40s to teach these new methods to smaller landowners.
So this wasn't just about being environmentally responsible, although that was important. It was also about the economic health of the community.
Absolutely crucial. By adopting sustainable practices, the Crossett Lumber Company ensured they'd have a steady supply of timber for years to come. It allowed them to stay competitive in the industry. They also branched out, started producing chemical wood in 1931, and opened a craft paper mill in 1937, using more of the wood, reducing waste.
So Crossett became a model, a town that showed how a community dependent on timber could actually thrive by managing their forests responsibly.
Exactly. They went from a town built on what seemed like unlimited resources to a national model for responsible forestry. And the Crossett Experimental Forest, it's still going strong, still influencing forestry practices today.
And at the center of all this is Cap Gates.
Yeah.
What would you say his most significant legacy is?
Well, he was the founder, the on-site manager who built Crossett from nothing. But I think what's really remarkable is that he was able to adapt, to see that the old ways of logging weren't sustainable in the long run, and to embrace these new ideas.
And he wasn't just focused on profits. He was deeply invested in the community.
Without a doubt. The Rose Inn is a great example of that. And then there's a story of the X-ray machine. His wife, Rose, was diagnosed with stomach cancer in the mid-1920s, and he was determined to get her the best care possible. He worked with General Electric to get this state-of-the-art X-ray machine, built a special wing at the hospital with lead-lined walls for safety, even made sure the doctor and nurse were trained to use it. Tragically, Rose passed away, but that machine continued to benefit the community for years. A real testament to his commitment to the people of Crossett.
That's an incredible story. He could have easily sent his wife to a big city for treatment, but he chose to bring that technology to Crossett.
And on top of that, his vision for sustainable forestry was so important for the town's future. He understood that their prosperity depended on the health of the forests. Sadly, he died in 1935 at the age of 69. But his decisions, his commitment to sustainability, they laid the foundation for Crossett's continued success.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this amazing story, what stands out to you most?
Well, I think Crossett's story is really inspiring. It shows how a community built around resource extraction can adapt, innovate, and ultimately thrive by embracing sustainability. They went from a rough wilderness to a lumber town to a leader in sustainable forestry, all thanks to the vision of one man. And the details, the X-ray machine, the logging camps, they really bring this history to life.
It makes you think about the unexpected ways that communities and industries can evolve, especially when they're facing resource limitations. And it highlights the power of individual vision. Makes you wonder what other industries out there might be ripe for this kind of transformation if the right people stepped up.
That's a great question. It challenges us to look beyond the surface and see the potential for positive change. If any of our listeners are interested in exploring this further, I'd recommend looking into the history of company towns or the evolution of forestry practices. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and if you have any personal connections to this amazing story from Arkansas.